What makes a country rise to power, dominate half the globe, and collapse spectacularly? How did Russia transform into a global superpower, and why did it fall apart? From the chaos of revolution to the height of global domination, and finally to a dramatic collapse. This is how Russia became a superpower and built the Soviet Union and its legacy today. Stay tuned as we will cover the revolution that started it all, its meteoric rise to power, and the shadows it still cast over the world. This is the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. Imagine living in a world where you're struggling just to survive, with a ruler who doesn't seem to care at all. That was Russia in the early 1900s. People were fed up, and in 1917, they decided enough was enough. After years of being crushed under Tsar Nicholas II's rule, people were finally fed up with the inequality, poverty, and endless wars. Workers, soldiers, and peasants, tired of fighting and living in misery, flooded the streets. The tipping point came when they stormed the Winter Palace and brought an end to centuries of monarchy. Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik party. Lenin promised a better future where the workers and peasants would finally have a voice, a life that wasn't controlled by the elite. His speeches lit a fire in people who had suffered for generations, and millions of Russians joined the movement. But the revolution didn't bring peace. Instead, it sparked a bloody civil war. The Red Army, supporting the Bolsheviks, fought against the White Army, which was made up of monarchists and foreign forces. The war tore the country apart, and by the time it ended in 1922, millions were dead. Russia was left in ruins. But from that chaos came the creation of the USSR, a new communist state. The revolution did not resolve all issues. In 1924, Lenin passed away, creating a power vacuum that led to infighting within the Communist Party. This situation paved the way for one of history's most infamous figures to rise to power, Joseph Stalin. After Lenin died in 1924, the Soviet Union was at a crossroads. Joseph Stalin quickly rose to power, not by chance but through calculated moves and sheer ruthlessness. By the 1930s, Stalin had cemented his control, and his vision for the USSR took center stage. He introduced the 5-year plans, a series of ambitious goals to industrialize the country at breakneck speed. Massive factories seemed to appear overnight, producing steel, machinery, and weapons on a scale the world couldn't ignore. By the end of the decade, the USSR had transformed into the world's second-largest industrial producer. But this rapid progress came with a devastating price. Stalin's policies of forced collectivization targeted millions of farmers, leading to widespread famine and death. Resistance wasn't tolerated. Those who defied the system were labeled enemies of the state and sent to gulags, brutal labor camps where survival was rare. Yet despite the human cost, by the late 1930s, Stalin had built a formidable Soviet Union. The country was no longer just a player on the world stage. It was a force to be reckoned with. However, Stalin's ambitions would soon collide with global events that no one could ignore. World War II was on the horizon. The Soviet Union's industrial and military growth under Stalin would be put to the ultimate test when the world plunged into war. It would be a tragedy unlike anything seen before, but for the USSR, it would also mark the beginning of its rise as a global superpower. World War II wasn't just a global conflict. It was a defining moment for the Soviet Union. The cost was staggering. An estimated 27 million Soviet lives were lost. But it was also a test of resilience, and the USSR's strength under unimaginable pressure reshaped its role on the world stage. Key moments like the siege of Leningrad showed the unbreakable spirit of the Soviet people. For 872 days, the city endured starvation and relentless bombing, but never surrendered. Then came the Battle of Stalingrad, a turning point in the war. Soviet forces not only held their ground but delivered a crushing defeat to the German army, shifting the momentum in favor of the Allies. By 1945, Soviet troops stormed Berlin, playing a decisive role in the fall of Nazi Germany. This victory solidified the USSR as one of the triumphant Allied powers, but Stalin wasn't content with just winning the war. He quickly capitalized on the Soviet Union's newfound influence, extending control over Eastern Europe. Churchill famously described this post-war division as the Iron Curtain, marking the start of a new global rivalry, the Cold War. The triumphs of World War II solidified the USSR as a global superpower, but victory came with a price. The Cold War that followed would pit the Soviet Union against the United States in an ideological battle, with the entire world caught in the crossfire. The Cold War wasn't fought with soldiers on battlefields. It was a war of ideologies, capitalism versus communism. The Soviet Union and the United States became locked in a nuclear arms race, each amassing enough weapons to obliterate the planet. The USSR formed alliances like the Warsaw Pact and fought for influence in proxy wars from Korea to Vietnam. It was a global chess game where every move carried high stakes. But while the Soviet government focused on military strength and the space race, life for ordinary citizens was far less glamorous. Economic hardships, constant shortages, and a lack of basic goods highlighted cracks in the Soviet system. These internal struggles raised questions about how long the USSR could sustain its global ambitions. After Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union was left grappling with the immense shadow of his legacy. And here where Nikita Khrushchev came in, a leader determined to distance the USSR from the darkest chapters of its history. He boldly denounced Stalin's brutal policies in his famous secret speech in 1956, which shocked the nation. This marked the beginning of De-Stalinization, a sweeping effort to dismantle the cult of Stalin. Statues of Stalin were removed, political prisoners were released from gulags, and some political freedoms were cautiously restored. Khrushchev hoped these reforms would breathe new life into the Soviet Union and repair its reputation. But his leadership wasn't without setbacks. Khrushchev's ambitious agricultural reforms, including the Virgin Lands campaign, aimed to boost food production but instead resulted in severe shortages. The USSR's economy struggled to balance modernization with its authoritarian past, leaving many to question if true progress could be achieved under the rigid constraints of Soviet rule. Khrushchev's time in power was marked by bold promises and mixed results, but it also set the stage for one of the Soviet Union's most impressive accomplishments, its dominance in the race to conquer the stars. If there was one area where the Soviet Union stunned the world, it was in space exploration. The USSR's space program became a powerful symbol of its scientific and technological prowess during the Cold War. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. This small, beeping sphere sent shockwaves across the globe and sparked the space race with the United States. Just 4 years later, in 1961, the Soviet Union made history again when Yuri Gagarin became the first human to journey into space. His orbit around Earth was a monumental achievement, cementing Soviet dominance in space exploration, at least for a time. These feats weren't just about science, they were acts of political theater. For the USSR, space success demonstrated the supposed superiority of communism, offering a bright contrast to the challenges and hardships within its borders. However, while the Soviet Union reached for the stars, cracks were growing beneath the surface. The space program showcased brilliance, but the broader system still struggled to deliver on its promises, setting the stage for future challenges. The 1980s marked a critical turning point for the Soviet Union. Under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, the USSR faced growing internal pressures that would ultimately lead to its collapse. Gorbachev introduced two landmark policies: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. These reforms were designed to modernize the political and economic systems, promoting transparency and encouraging economic flexibility. However, these well-intentioned reforms had unintended consequences. While they opened up long-suppressed discussions about government inefficiency and corruption, they also highlighted the deep flaws of the Soviet system. Economic stagnation continued, exacerbated by the prolonged and unsuccessful Soviet war in Afghanistan, which drained resources and morale. Meanwhile, growing unrest within Soviet republics, fueled by rising nationalism and demands for independence, further destabilized the Union. By 1989, the winds of change had spread beyond the USSR's borders, with the Berlin Wall falling, signaling the end of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. Then, in 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union officially dissolved, marking the end of an era that had shaped the world for nearly 70 years. While the Soviet Union became a relic of history, its legacy continues to echo in global politics. Today, Russia, under Vladimir Putin, is attempting to reclaim some of that former power, even as the world watches to see if this marks the return of a new kind of rivalry. In the decades following the fall of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Putin emerged as a dominant force in Russian politics. Seeking to restore Russia's strength and international influence, Putin's actions have raised questions about his ambitions for reviving the country's role as a global power. From the 2008 invasion of Georgia to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, Putin's foreign policies have reflected a desire to reassert Russian dominance over former Soviet republics. These actions often hark back to the imperial ambitions of the Soviet Union. And while Russia today isn't the same as the USSR, the echoes of its past are hard to ignore. But the question remains, is Putin's Russia headed toward a new Cold War? As tensions rise, particularly with NATO in the West, the world faces the possibility of a renewed geopolitical struggle. The question of whether Russia seeks to recreate something resembling the USSR is still up for debate. What is clear, however, is that Russia's ambitions and its actions are shaping a new era of global conflict. From revolution to superpower, and from collapse to resurgence, the story of the Soviet Union is one of ambition, power, and legacy. As the world watches how Russia continues to assert itself on the global stage, we can't help but wonder, is history repeating itself? Will the past come to define the future, or will new forces drive Russia toward a different path? Only time will tell. What do you think about Russia's journey? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and want to keep learning about history's most pivotal moments, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with friends who love exploring topics like this. We'll keep bringing you insightful content, so hit that notification bell to stay updated. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.